March 1945. The Rhine River stretched before the Allied forces like a final barrier between them and the heart of Nazi Germany. Along its banks, German artillery positions watched, waited, calculated. Their spotters scanned the western shore through binoculars, counting tanks, tracking troop movements, reporting everything back to command. What they saw terrified them. An entire American armored division massing near Viersen. Hundreds of tanks, artillery batteries, supply convoys stretching for miles. The radio chatter was constant, frantic, commanders barking orders, tank engines roaring through the night. But there was something they didn't see, something impossible to detect through field glasses or radio intercepts. Every single tank was made of rubber. Every artillery piece was inflatable. Every radio transmission was scripted theater. And the entire division, all those thousands of men they thought they were tracking, was actually 1,100 artists, sound engineers, and actors. They called themselves the Ghost Army, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. And in the final year of World War II, they staged the greatest deception in military history. Not with bullets, but with brushes. Not with bombs, but with balloons. They didn't kill the enemy. They confused them, misdirected them, made them see armies that didn't exist, and miss the real threats until it was too late. This is the story of the men who painted their way across Europe, who inflated tanks in the dead of night, who played the sounds of war through speakers hidden in forests, who wore the uniforms of generals they'd never met and drove trucks in circles to fake convoy dust. They saved thousands of lives. They changed the course of battles. And for 50 years, no one knew they existed. Because the Ghost Army wasn't just classified, it was erased. Until one day, a son found his father's sketchbook and asked a simple question. "Dad, why are all your war drawings of rubber tanks the birth of deception? The idea didn't start with artists, it started with failure. In 1942, the British were desperate. German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be built. Rommel was tearing through North Africa, and every time the Allies tried to mount an offensive, German intelligence seemed to know exactly where they'd strike. The British needed an edge, not more tanks, not more men. They needed the Germans to look the wrong way. So they turned to a man named Dudley Clark, a British officer who'd spent years studying magic, theater, and the psychology of perception. Clark's idea was radical. What if you could create entire armies out of nothing? Not real soldiers, but the illusion of soldiers. Fake radio traffic, dummy tanks, inflatable artillery. If you could make the enemy believe you were attacking from the east, you could strike from the west while they scrambled to defend the wrong position. The British tested it in North Africa. They built hundreds of fake tanks out of plywood and canvas. They positioned them in the desert, complete with fake tire tracks and dummy supply dumps. German reconnaissance planes photographed them. German commanders repositioned entire divisions to counter the threat. And when the real attack came from a completely different direction, the Germans were caught flat-footed. The deception worked. Lives were saved, battles were won, and the Allies realized they'd stumbled onto something powerful. Clark's most famous operation was Operation Bertram, the deception plan for the Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. The British needed to attack from the north, but they wanted the Germans to expect an attack from the south. So Clark's team built an entire fake army in the southern sector. Dummy tanks, fake supply dumps, dummy artillery positions. They even built a fake water pipeline, adding a few sections each day to make it look like they were slowly preparing for an offensive that would take weeks. Meanwhile, in the north, where the real attack would come, they disguised real tanks as supply trucks using canvas covers. They hid artillery pieces. They made their actual buildup look like routine supply operations. The Germans, watching from the air and through binoculars, saw exactly what Clark wanted them to see. A slow buildup in the south. Nothing unusual in the north. When the British attacked from the north on October 23rd, the Germans were completely surprised. Their forces were positioned wrong. Their reserves were in the wrong place, and by the time they realized they'd been deceived, it was too late. The British broke through. Rommel's Africa Corps was defeated, and the tide of the war in North Africa turned. American military observers watched Clark's operations with fascination. They saw the potential. They understood that deception could be as powerful as firepower, and they wanted to create their own deception unit. But they wanted something more sophisticated than plywood tanks. They needed artists, people who understood light, shadow, perspective, people who could make a painting look real from 500 yards, people who could think like set designers, because that's exactly what modern warfare had become. A stage, and the Ghost Army would be its greatest production. The call went out quietly. The Army didn't advertise. They didn't post flyers. Instead, recruiters visited art schools, Parsons, Pratt, Cooper Union, the Philadelphia Museum School of Industrial Art. They looked for students with steady hands and creative minds, men who could sketch quickly, think spatially, and keep secrets. The pitch was vague. Special assignment, classified work. You'll be using your skills to support the war effort. Most of the recruits had no idea what they were signing up for. Some thought they'd be painting propaganda posters. Others assumed they'd be designing camouflage patterns. None of them imagined they'd be building an army out of air and lies. Among the first recruits was a 21-year-old fashion illustrator from New York named Arthur Shillstone. He'd been studying at Pratt when the recruiter approached him. The man wore civilian clothes, spoke in careful, measured tones, and asked Arthur a strange question. If you had to make someone believe a painting was a photograph, how would you do it? Arthur thought for a moment. Lighting, he said. Shadows. Perspective. The small imperfections that make something feel real. The recruiter smiled. You'll do just fine. Another recruit was Bill Blass, a young designer who would later become one of America's most famous fashion icons. In 1943, he was just a kid from Indiana who could sketch a dress in under a minute and had an eye for detail that bordered on obsessive. There was Ellsworth Kelly, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated abstract painters of the 20th century. In the Ghost Army, he painted fake insignias on fake tanks and learned to see the world in shapes and shadows. There was Art Kane, who would later photograph some of the most iconic images in jazz history. In the war, he learned to frame deception like a photograph, making sure every angle told the story they wanted the enemy to see. There was also Harold Lehner, a young artist from the Bronx who specialized in typography and design. He would spend the war painting fake unit markings on vehicles and creating false road signs that directed imaginary divisions to non-existent headquarters. And there was George Vander Sluis, a painter from Michigan who had studied at the Art Institute of Chicago. He would become one of the Ghost Army's most skilled camouflage artists, able to make a rubber tank look weathered and battle-worn in under an hour. These weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were creators, dreamers, men who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be made to appear. And the Army was about to teach them how to weaponize that vision. Training began in the spring of 1943 at Camp Forest in Tennessee, and later at Pine Camp in upstate New York. The men arrived expecting boot camp. What they got was theater school mixed with engineering class. They learned to inflate 40-foot-long Sherman tanks using air compressors. They practiced erecting dummy artillery pieces in under 20 minutes. They studied how shadows fell at different times of day, so their fakes would look real from the air. They memorized the insignias of dozens of different divisions so they could impersonate any unit in the Army. But the most important lesson wasn't technical. It was psychological. Their instructors, many of them veterans of British deception units, drilled one concept into their heads. The enemy doesn't see reality. They see what they expect to see. Your job is to give them that expectation and then exploit it. One instructor, a British major named Jasper Maskelyne, who had been a professional magician before the war, taught them the principles of stage magic. Misdirection, he said, is everything. You don't hide the trick. You make the audience look somewhere else while you perform it. In war, the audience is the enemy, and if you can make them look the wrong way, you've already won. The training was intense. The men learned to work in complete darkness, inflating tanks and setting up equipment without lights that might give away their position. They learned to move silently, to communicate with hand signals, to work as a coordinated team. They also learned the technical details of the equipment they'd be using. The inflatable tanks were marvels of engineering, but they were also fragile. A single puncture could deflate one in minutes. So the men learned to patch them, to maintain them, to handle them carefully, even in the chaos of a battlefield. The sonic equipment was equally complex. The recordings had to be played at exactly the right volume, from exactly the right position, to create a convincing illusion. Too loud, and the Germans would know something was wrong. Too quiet, and they wouldn't hear it at all. The sonic operators learned to read terrain, to understand how sound traveled over different landscapes, to adjust their equipment for wind and weather. The radio operators learned the patterns of military communication, how officers spoke, what kind of messages were sent at what times, the rhythms and cadences of real military radio traffic. They practiced until they could improvise convincingly, creating the sound of a real headquarters coordinating real operations. It was a strange kind of warfare. No guns, no grenades, just rubber, paint, and the understanding that in war, perception could be deadlier than any bullet. By the time they shipped out to Europe in 1944, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had become something unprecedented in military history. An army designed not to fight, but to deceive, not to kill, but to confuse, not to hold ground, but to make the enemy think ground was being held when it wasn't. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to stage over 20 major deceptions across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They would impersonate entire divisions. They would fake river crossings, phantom buildups, and ghost invasions. And in doing so, they would save an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 Allied lives, all with rubber tanks, painted canvas, and the greatest special effect in history: the illusion of war, the tools of illusion. When the Ghost Army landed in France in the summer of 1944, just weeks after D-Day, they brought with them the strangest arsenal ever assembled. No bullets, no bombs, just props. And those props had to be good enough to fool German reconnaissance planes flying at 10,000 feet, binoculars scanning from miles away, and spies embedded in French villages. The centerpiece of their deception was the inflatable tank. These weren't toys. They were engineering marvels. Each one weighed about 85 pounds deflated and could be inflated in under 15 minutes using a portable air compressor. Once inflated, they looked from a distance exactly like a 30-ton M4 Sherman tank. The details were astonishing. The rubber was painted with precise camouflage patterns. Fake treads were molded into the base. Even the gun barrels were angled correctly. From the air or through binoculars at 500 yards, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. But the Ghost Army didn't just inflate them and walk away. They staged them. They positioned the tanks in formations that matched real armored units. They created fake tire tracks, leading to and from each position using special rollers. They even hung laundry nearby and dug fake latrines to make it look like soldiers were living there. One soldier later recalled the surreal experience of setting up a fake tank battalion. "We'd arrive at night," he said, "inflate 20 or 30 tanks in a field, add some dummy artillery pieces, scatter a few jeeps around. By morning, it looked like an entire armored division had moved in overnight. Then we'd leave, and the real units would move somewhere else entirely." The inflatable tanks weren't the only trick. The Ghost Army also used dummy artillery pieces, fake supply dumps, and inflatable trucks. They built plywood airplanes and positioned them on fake airstrips. They even created dummy landing craft for river crossings, complete with fake wake patterns painted on the water. The attention to detail was extraordinary. The artists would add mud to the tanks to make them look used. They'd create fake oil stains on the ground beneath them. They'd position them at slightly different angles, the way real tank crews would park them. They'd even add small personal touches, a helmet hanging on a turret, a jerry can strapped to the side, anything that would make the scene look authentic. But visual deception was only half the equation. The Ghost Army also had to sound real. That's where the sonic deception unit came in. This was perhaps the most ingenious part of the operation. The unit was equipped with massive speakers, some weighing over 500 pounds, that could project sound up to 15 miles. They had recordings of everything: tank engines starting, trucks shifting gears, soldiers shouting orders, artillery being loaded, entire convoys on the move. These weren't just random noises. They were carefully orchestrated soundscapes, mixed and timed to create the illusion of specific military operations. The recordings were made at real army bases, using real equipment. Sound engineers would record tanks starting up, moving, idling. They'd record the specific sounds of different vehicles, Shermans, half-tracks, supply trucks, so they could create the audio signature of different types of units. They even recorded the sounds of bridge construction, of engineers working, of equipment being unloaded. Every sound that a real military unit would make, they had a recording of it. And they could mix these sounds together to create incredibly convincing audio illusions. The sonic unit would set up their speakers in forests or behind hills, hidden from view, but positioned so the sound would carry toward German lines. Then, at night, they'd play their recordings. The Germans would hear what sounded like an entire armored division moving into position. They'd report it. Their commanders would reposition forces to counter the threat, and the real attack would come from somewhere else entirely. One of the sonic operators, a man named Harold Dahl, described it like this: "We were DJs of war. We'd mix tracks, adjust volume, time everything perfectly. If we did it right, The Germans would hear exactly what we wanted them to hear, and nothing else. The sonic deceptions were incredibly effective. In one operation, the Ghost Army played the sounds of a bridge being built across a river. For 3 nights, the Germans heard the sounds of construction, of hammers and saws and engineers shouting. They positioned artillery to target the bridge. They prepared defenses on the far bank. But there was no bridge, just speakers in the woods playing a recording. And while the Germans focused on the fake bridge, the real crossing happened 5 miles downstream. By the time they realized they'd been fooled, Allied forces had established a bridgehead and were pouring across. But the deception didn't stop with sights and sounds. The Ghost Army also had a radio deception unit. These were men who understood signal intelligence, radio protocols, and the patterns of military communication. Their job was to impersonate other units over the radio. They'd set up transmitters and broadcast fake messages using the call signs and codes of real divisions. They'd create the radio chatter of a headquarters coordinating troop movements, supply requests, casualty reports. Everything had to sound authentic because the Germans were listening. German signal intelligence units monitored Allied radio traffic constantly. They tracked call signs, analyzed communication patterns, and used that information to map Allied positions and predict attacks. The Ghost Army exploited that. They fed the Germans false information through carefully scripted radio performances. One operator recalled the pressure. You couldn't just read a script. You had to sound like a real officer. Tired, stressed, making decisions in real time. If you sounded too rehearsed, they'd know it was fake. So we improvised. We made mistakes on purpose. We cursed. We sounded human, because that's what made it believable. The radio operators would create entire fictional command structures. They'd have fake colonels talking to fake majors about fake operations. They'd request supplies that would never arrive. They'd report casualties that never happened. They'd create the complete radio signature of a division that didn't exist. And the Germans would listen, plot the positions on their maps, and make decisions based on information that was completely false. It was psychological warfare at its finest. The Ghost Army was getting inside the enemy's decision-making process and feeding them lies that would lead them to make fatal mistakes. The final piece of the deception was the special effects unit. These were the artists, the painters, the men who added the finishing touches that made everything feel real. They painted insignias on the fake tanks. They created fake road signs pointing to fake headquarters. They even dressed in the uniforms of other divisions and drove through nearby towns, making sure locals and potential spies saw the wrong units in the area. One artist, a man named Arthur Singer, later described the work as the strangest art project imaginable. We were painting lies, he said, but they had to be perfect lies. A shadow in the wrong place, a color slightly off, and the whole illusion could collapse. So we painted like our lives depended on it. Because they did. Other people's lives anyway. The special effects unit would also create what they called atmosphere. They'd set up fake command posts with guards outside. They'd have soldiers walking around in the uniforms of the unit they were impersonating. They'd create the bustle and activity of a real military installation. They'd even stage fake meetings, with officers in the appropriate uniforms gathering at the fake headquarters, saluting, looking serious. All of it was theater. But it was theater that had to be convincing enough to fool enemy spies and reconnaissance. The Ghost Army's equipment was constantly evolving. They learned from each operation. If a dummy tank looked wrong from a certain angle, they'd adjust the design. If a sound recording didn't quite match the real thing, they'd re-record it. They were artists and engineers, constantly refining their craft. And the stakes were enormous. If the Germans figured out they were being deceived, the entire operation would collapse. Worse, the real units the Ghost Army was covering for would be exposed and vulnerable. So every detail mattered. Every shadow, every sound, every radio transmission. It all had to be perfect. And for the most part, it was. The first operation, the Ghost Army's first major operation, came in September 1944, near the town of Brest in Brittany, France. The mission was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Make the Germans think the 2nd Armored Division was preparing to attack from the south, while the real division moved north. The men of the 23rd arrived at night, as they always would. Trucks rolled in quietly, headlights off, guided by moonlight and whispered directions. They had less than 6 hours to set up an entire armored division before dawn. The inflation crews went to work first. They unloaded the rubber tanks from their trucks, each one folded and packed like a massive sleeping bag. They connected the air compressors, and slowly, almost magically, the tanks began to take shape. One by one, they rose from the ground like strange mechanical ghosts. By 3 a.m., there were 40 tanks positioned across 2 fields. The artists moved in next, touching up paint, adjusting camouflage netting, making sure every detail was perfect. They added fake tire tracks using special rollers. They scattered equipment around the tanks, helmets, empty fuel cans, anything that would make it look like soldiers had been there. Meanwhile, the sonic unit set up their speakers in a nearby forest. They tested the sound levels, making sure the recordings would carry to German positions without being too obvious. At 4 a.m., they began playing the sounds of tank engines, low rumbling that echoed through the valley. The radio unit started broadcasting at the same time. Fake messages between fake commanders, supply requests, status reports, all using the call signs of the 2nd Armored Division. The Germans were listening. They heard everything. As dawn broke, German reconnaissance planes flew over. Their cameras clicked. The photos went back to German intelligence. The analysts studied them. Tanks, lots of tanks, positioned for an attack from the south. The Germans reinforced their southern defenses. They moved artillery. They repositioned infantry. They prepared for an assault that would never come. Because 20 miles to the north, the real 2nd Armored Division was moving into position. And when they attacked, the Germans were looking the wrong way. The operation was a success. The Ghost Army had pulled off their first major deception. But there was no celebration, no time to rest, because the next operation was already being planned. Over the next 10 months, the Ghost Army would stage over 20 major deceptions, each one more complex than the last, each one a high-wire act of coordination, timing, and nerve. They would impersonate the 1st Infantry Division, the 5th Armored Division, the 75th Infantry Division, and more. They would fake build-ups, withdrawals, and entire offensives. And with each operation, they got better. They learned to read the terrain, to understand how the Germans thought, to anticipate what would make the deception believable. They became masters of illusion, magicians in uniform. But they also learned something else. That deception, no matter how well executed, was dangerous. Because if the Germans ever figured out what they were doing, the Ghost Army would be in serious trouble. They carried weapons, but they weren't a combat unit. If they were caught in the middle of a deception, they'd be sitting ducks. That fear was always there. Every time they inflated a tank, Every time they played a sound recording, every time they broadcast a fake radio message, they knew they were gambling, and the stakes were life and death. One soldier later wrote in his diary, "We're actors on the world's most dangerous stage. If the audience figures out it's a show, the curtain doesn't just close, it crashes down on top of us." But they kept performing, because they knew what was at stake. Every successful deception meant fewer, real soldiers in harm's way. Every time they fooled the Germans, they saved lives. And that made the risk worth it. The operation at Luxembourg. By March 1945, the Ghost Army had become legends within the small circle of officers who knew they existed. But their greatest test was still ahead. The Rhine River crossing. The Rhine was the last major natural barrier between the Allies and the heart of Germany. Crossing it would require a massive, coordinated assault. Thousands of troops, hundreds of boats, artillery support, air cover, and absolute surprise. The problem was, the Germans knew it was coming. They just didn't know where. The Rhine stretched for hundreds of miles. The Allies could cross anywhere. The Germans had to defend everywhere, unless they could be convinced the attack was coming from one specific location. That's where the Ghost Army came in. The plan was called Operation Viersen. The Ghost Army would stage a massive buildup near the town of Viersen, making it look like the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions were preparing to cross there. Meanwhile, the real divisions would cross 10 miles south, near a town called Rheinberg. It was the Ghost Army's most ambitious operation yet. They would have to create the illusion of 2 full divisions, over 30,000 men, for more than a week. Every detail had to be perfect, because the Germans would be watching closely. The operation began on March 18th. The Ghost Army moved into position near Viersen under cover of darkness. They brought everything: inflatable tanks, dummy artillery, sound trucks, radio equipment, and over 600 men ready to stage the performance of their lives. The first night, they inflated over 100 tanks. They positioned them in fields, forests, and along roads, creating the appearance of a massive armored buildup. They added dummy supply dumps, fake command posts, and even inflatable trucks to simulate convoy traffic. The artists worked through the night, painting insignias, adjusting camouflage, making sure everything looked real. One artist later recalled, "We were exhausted, freezing, but we couldn't stop. Every detail mattered. A single mistake could blow the whole operation." The sonic unit set up their speakers along the river. They played recordings of boats being loaded, engines revving, soldiers shouting. The sounds echoed across the water, carrying to German positions on the far bank. The Germans heard it. They reported it. They believed it. The radio unit broadcast constantly fake orders, fake supply requests, fake casualty reports. They created the radio signature of 2 divisions preparing for a major assault. German signal intelligence picked it up. They tracked the transmissions. They mapped the positions. Everything pointed to Viersen. But the Ghost Army didn't just rely on technology. They also used human deception. Soldiers from the Ghost Army, wearing the patches of the 30th and 79th Divisions, drove through nearby towns. They stopped at cafes. They talked to locals. They made sure everyone saw them. Because the Germans had spies, informants in the local population who reported troop movements. The Ghost Army wanted those reports to reach German intelligence. They wanted the Germans to hear from multiple sources that the attack was coming at Viersen. For a week, the Ghost Army maintained the illusion. Every night they adjusted positions. added new elements, kept the deception fresh. They knew German reconnaissance planes were flying over daily. They knew the photos were being analyzed. They had to make sure the story stayed consistent. And it worked. German commanders, convinced the attack was coming at Viersen, reinforced their defenses there. They moved artillery. They positioned infantry. They prepared for a massive assault. On March 23rd, the real attack came at Rheinberg. The 30th and 79th Divisions crossed the Rhine with minimal resistance. The Germans, focused on Viersen, were caught completely off guard. By the time they realized they'd been deceived, it was too late. The Allies had established a bridgehead. Thousands of troops poured across. The road to Germany was open. The Ghost Army had pulled off their greatest deception. They had fooled an entire German army, and in doing so, they had saved countless lives. One officer later estimated that the Viersen deception alone saved between 5,000 and 10,000 Allied casualties. Because the Germans were defending the wrong position, the real attack faced far less resistance. Fewer soldiers died. Fewer were wounded. The crossing, which could have been a bloodbath, was almost routine. But the men of the Ghost Army didn't celebrate. They packed up their rubber tanks, loaded their sound equipment, and moved on to the next operation. Because the war wasn't over. And there were more illusions to create, more lives to save. The close calls. Not every operation went smoothly. The Ghost Army operated close to the front lines, often within range of German artillery, and there were times when things went wrong, times when they came dangerously close to being discovered, times when the illusion nearly collapsed. One of the closest calls came during an operation near the German border in late 1944. The Ghost Army was setting up a fake tank battalion in a forest clearing. It was night. They were working by moonlight, inflating tanks, positioning equipment. Everything was going according to plan. Then they heard voices. German voices. A patrol had stumbled onto their position. The Ghost Army soldiers froze. They were armed, but they weren't trained for combat. They were artists and engineers, not infantry. And they were in the middle of inflating rubber tanks. If the Germans discovered what they were doing, the entire deception would be compromised. One of the Ghost Army soldiers, a man named Jack Macy, later described what happened. We could hear them getting closer. We couldn't see them, but we could hear them talking, maybe 50 yards away. We all grabbed our rifles. We were terrified, not just for ourselves, but because if they figured out what we were doing, it would blow everything. The Ghost Army soldiers spread out, taking cover behind the inflatable tanks. They waited. The German patrol came closer. Then, incredibly, they walked right past. They never saw the Americans. They never noticed the half-inflated tanks in the darkness. They just kept walking, their voices fading into the night. The Ghost Army soldiers waited for 20 minutes, barely breathing, before they resumed their work. But they worked faster after that, and they posted guards, because they'd been reminded of just how dangerous their mission was. Another close call came during the Rhine crossing operation. A German artillery shell landed in the middle of one of the fake tank positions. It didn't hit any of the inflatable tanks directly, but the shrapnel punctured 3 of them. They deflated instantly, collapsing like balloons. The Ghost Army soldiers had to work fast. They dragged the deflated tanks away and replaced them with new ones before dawn, before the German reconnaissance planes flew over. They worked through the night, racing against time. By morning, the position looked perfect again. The Germans never knew anything had gone wrong. But perhaps the most dangerous moment came during an operation in Luxembourg. The Ghost Army was impersonating the 4th Armored Division, creating the illusion of a major buildup. They'd set up their fake tanks, their dummy artillery, everything was in place. Then the Germans attacked. Not the fake position, but a real American unit nearby. And in the chaos of the battle, German troops began moving toward the Ghost Army's position. The Ghost Army soldiers found themselves in the middle of a real firefight. They weren't supposed to be there. They weren't trained for this. But they had no choice. They grabbed their weapons and fought back. For several hours, the Ghost Army held their position, trading fire with German infantry. Several men were wounded. One was killed. Eventually, reinforcements arrived and drove the Germans back. But the Ghost Army had been exposed to real combat. And it shook them. They'd signed up to create illusions, not to fight. But war doesn't always respect those distinctions. One Ghost Army veteran later said, "We were lucky. Most of the time we could do our job and stay out of harm's way. But there were moments when the war found us anyway. And in those moments we had to be soldiers. Real soldiers. Not just artists playing dress-up." These close calls were a constant reminder of the danger they faced. The Ghost Army operated in a strange gray area. They were close enough to the front lines to be in danger, but not equipped or trained to defend themselves effectively. They relied on stealth, on deception, on the hope that the Germans would never discover what they were really doing. And for the most part, they succeeded. But the fear was always there. The knowledge that one mistake, one unlucky moment, could expose them, could get them killed, could compromise the entire operation and put real soldiers at risk. It was a burden they carried silently, because they couldn't talk about it, couldn't share their fears with anyone outside the unit. They just had to keep performing, keep creating illusions, keep gambling with their lives, and hope that their luck held. The artists at war. What made the Ghost Army unique wasn't just their mission. It was who they were. These weren't career soldiers. They were artists, designers, and dreamers who'd been handed the strangest assignment in military history. And in the brief moments between operations, they did what artists do. They created. Many of them kept sketchbooks. During downtime, they'd draw the French countryside, the ruins of bombed-out towns, the faces of fellow soldiers. They painted watercolors of sunsets over the Rhine. They sketched the very rubber tanks they'd spent the night inflating. Arthur Shilstone filled dozens of sketchbooks with scenes from the war. Not propaganda, not heroic battle scenes, just honest observations. A tired soldier sleeping against a tree, a French child watching a convoy pass, the strange, surreal sight of an inflatable tank sitting in a field. Years later, Shilstone would say, "We were documenting a war that didn't exist. We were creating fake armies, but we were also witnessing real history. And we couldn't help but record it." Bill Blass, the future fashion designer, spent his downtime sketching uniform designs. He'd study how soldiers wore their gear, how fabric moved, how dirt and wear changed the appearance of clothing. That eye for detail would later make him one of the most successful designers in America. Ellsworth Kelly painted abstract compositions inspired by camouflage patterns, the way colors broke up shapes, the way shadows created depth. The war taught him to see the world in fragments, in geometric forms. That vision would define his art for the rest of his life. But the art wasn't just personal. It was part of the mission. The Ghost Army needed artists who could think spatially, who understood light and shadow, who could make a fake tank look real from 1,000 yards. And those skills came from years of training, of seeing the world not as it was, but as it could be represented. One artist, a man named Ned Harris, later described the strange duality of their work. By day we were soldiers, we followed orders, we set up equipment, we maintained the illusion. But at night, when the work was done, we were artists again. We drew, we painted, we tried to make sense of what we were doing, because it was absurd. We were fighting a war with rubber and paint, and somehow it was working. The Ghost Army also had photographers, men like Art Kane, who documented their operations in secret. The photos were classified, never meant to be seen by the public. But they captured something extraordinary, the surreal reality of inflatable tanks in French fields, soldiers painting fake insignias, sound trucks hidden in forests. These photos would remain classified for decades. But when they were finally released, they revealed a side of World War II that few people knew existed. A war fought not with bullets, but with illusion. A war where artists became soldiers, and soldiers became artists. There was also music. Several members of the Ghost Army were musicians. They'd bring instruments, guitars, harmonicas, and play during downtime. They'd sing. They'd joke. They'd try to maintain some sense of normalcy in the middle of the chaos. One soldier, a jazz pianist from Chicago, would later say, "Music was our escape. We'd spend all day creating fake armies, lying to the enemy, living in this weird world of deception. And then at night, we'd play music, real music, honest music. It kept us sane." But the art and music weren't just distractions. They were reminders of who these men were. They weren't killers. They weren't warriors in the traditional sense. They were creators. And even in the middle of a war, they couldn't stop creating. That creativity also made them better at their jobs. Because deception requires imagination. It requires the ability to see the world from someone else's perspective, to understand what the enemy expects to see, and then give them that expectation in the most convincing way possible. The Ghost Army's artists understood that instinctively. They knew how to frame a scene, how to use light and shadow, how to create depth and realism. And they applied those skills to every operation. Every fake tank was positioned like a subject in a painting. Every dummy artillery piece was angled to catch the light correctly. Every detail was considered, refined, perfected. In a way, the Ghost Army was the ultimate art project, a collaboration between hundreds of artists, all working toward a single goal: to create an illusion so convincing that it would change the course of history. And they succeeded. Not because they were the best soldiers, but because they were the best artists. The human cost. The Ghost Army's operations were successful, but they weren't without cost. The men lived in constant danger. They operated close to the front lines, often within range of German artillery. And because their mission was classified, they couldn't tell anyone what they were really doing. If they were captured, they couldn't explain that they were part of a deception unit. They'd just be soldiers caught behind enemy lines. And the Germans didn't take kindly to spies. Several members of the Ghost Army had close calls. During one operation near the German border, a patrol of German soldiers stumbled onto a field of inflatable tanks. The Ghost Army soldiers, armed only with rifles and sidearms, had to hold them off until they could evacuate. One soldier later recalled, "We weren't trained for combat. We were artists, but in that moment, we had to fight. We fired back. We held the line, and we got out. But it was terrifying, because we knew if they captured us, if they figured out what we were doing, the whole operation would be compromised. There were casualties. Not many, but some. Men who were killed or wounded during operations. Men who died not in glorious combat, but in the strange twilight world of deception warfare. Their deaths were classified, their stories untold for decades. There were also psychological costs. The men of the Ghost Army lived in a strange, liminal space. They were soldiers, but not really. They were part of the war, but separate from it. They saw combat, but didn't fight in the traditional sense. And they couldn't talk about any of it. One soldier wrote in his diary, "Sometimes I feel like a ghost myself. We create these fake armies, these illusions, and then we disappear. No one knows we were there. No one knows what we did. And we can't tell them. It's like we don't exist." That sense of invisibility was compounded by the fact that their work was classified. Even after the war ended, they couldn't talk about it. The Ghost Army's operations remained secret for decades. The men went home, returned to their lives, and carried the weight of their experiences in silence. For some, that silence was unbearable. They'd been part of something extraordinary. They'd helped win the war. They'd saved thousands of lives. But they couldn't share that with anyone. Not their families. Not their friends. Not even other veterans. One Ghost Army veteran later said, "I'd go to veteran reunions, and guys would talk about the battles they fought, the medals they earned. And I'd just sit there, silent, because I couldn't tell them what I did. I couldn't explain that I spent the war inflating rubber tanks and playing sound effects. It sounded absurd, but it mattered. It saved lives. And no one knew." The secrecy also meant the Ghost Army received almost no recognition. There were no medals, no parades, no public acknowledgement of their contributions. They were written out of the official history of the war. Their operations were classified. Their records were sealed. For all intents and purposes, they didn't exist. It wasn't until the 1990s, nearly 50 years after the war ended, that the Ghost Army's story began to emerge. A few veterans started talking. Documents were declassified. Historians began piecing together what had happened. And slowly, the world learned about the artists who'd fought the war with rubber and paint. But by then, many of the Ghost Army veterans had already passed away. They'd lived their entire lives without recognition, without acknowledgement, without anyone knowing what they'd done. One veteran's son later said, "My father never talked about the war. I knew he'd served, but he never said what he did. It wasn't until after he died that I found his sketchbooks, drawings of inflatable tanks, fake artillery, and I realized he'd been part of something incredible." But he never got to tell that story. The Ghost Army's legacy is complicated. They were heroes. They saved lives. They changed the course of battles. But they did it in secret. And for decades, that secrecy erased them from history. It's only now, in the 21st century, that their story is finally being told, that their contributions are finally being recognized. In 2024, the Ghost Army was finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. It was a recognition that came far too late for most of the men who served. But for the few surviving veterans, it was a moment of validation, an acknowledgement that what they did mattered, that their art, their creativity, their courage had made a difference. One of the last surviving Ghost Army veterans, a man named Bernie Bluestein, said at the ceremony, "We didn't do it for medals. We did it because it needed to be done. But it's nice, after all these years, to finally be able to say, yes, we were there. Yes, we did that. And yes, it mattered. The revelation. For decades, the Ghost Army remained a secret. The men who served couldn't talk about it. The operations were classified. The equipment was destroyed or stored away in forgotten warehouses. The official records were sealed. It was as if the Ghost Army had never existed. But secrets have a way of surfacing. In the 1980s, a man named Rick Beyer, a documentary filmmaker, heard a strange story. His friend's father had served in World War II and had mentioned something about inflatable tanks. Beyer was intrigued. He started digging. What he found was astonishing. Buried in military archives were references to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, classified documents describing deception operations, photos of rubber tanks and dummy artillery. And slowly, Beyer began to piece together the story. He tracked down surviving Ghost Army veterans. Many of them had never spoken publicly about their service. Some were reluctant to talk, even decades later. The habit of secrecy was hard to break, but others were eager to finally share their stories. One veteran told Beyer, "I've been carrying this for 50 years. I've wanted to tell people what we did, but I couldn't. And after a while, I stopped trying. I figured no one would believe me anyway. Who would believe we fought the war with rubber tanks?" Beyer spent years researching. He interviewed dozens of veterans. He combed through declassified documents. He found the photos, the sketches, the recordings. And in 2013, he released a documentary called The Ghost Army. It was the first time the full story had been told publicly. The response was overwhelming. People were fascinated. How had this story remained hidden for so long? How had an entire unit, over 100 men, managed to keep a secret for decades? And why had the military kept it classified? The answer to that last question was strategic. The techniques the Ghost Army developed, inflatable decoys, sonic deception, radio spoofing, were still considered valuable. The military didn't want potential enemies to know exactly how they'd been used, so the operations remained classified long after the war ended. But by the 1990s, the techniques were outdated. Modern surveillance, satellites, electronic intelligence made the Ghost Army's methods obsolete. So the documents were declassified, and the story could finally be told. For the surviving veterans, the revelation was bittersweet. They were finally getting recognition. But so many of their comrades had already passed away. Men who'd carried the secret to their graves. Men who'd never gotten to share their stories. One veteran, a man named Jack Macy, said, "I wish my friends could have lived to see this, to see people finally understand what we did, to see the recognition. But they're gone, and all I can do is tell their stories for them." The Ghost Army's story also revealed something important about World War II. That the war wasn't just won with tanks and bombs. It was won with intelligence, creativity, and deception. The Ghost Army represented a different kind of warfare, one that relied on brains over brawn, on art over artillery. And their success proved something that military strategists had long suspected: that in war, perception matters as much as reality, that making the enemy believe something can be just as effective as making it true. That sometimes the best weapon isn't a gun, it's an idea. The Ghost Army's techniques influenced military thinking for decades. Modern military deception units still use many of the principles the Ghost Army developed. The idea of creating false signatures, visual, audio, electronic, to mislead the enemy, is now a standard part of military doctrine. But the Ghost Army was the first. They were the pioneers. They proved it could work. And they did it with rubber, paint, and an extraordinary amount of courage. Today, the Ghost Army's story is finally being told. There are books, documentaries, museum exhibits. The Smithsonian has a collection of Ghost Army artifacts. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans has an entire section dedicated to their operations. And in 2024, as mentioned, the Ghost Army was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. It was a recognition that came 80 years too late for most of the men who served. But it was a recognition nonetheless. An acknowledgement that what they did mattered. That their art, their creativity, their courage had changed the course of history. One of the last surviving Ghost Army veterans, speaking at the medal ceremony, said something that captured the essence of their mission. "We didn't kill the enemy. We confused them. We didn't destroy their armies. We made them look the wrong way, and in doing so, we saved lives. Real lives. That's what I'm most proud of. Not that we fooled the Germans, but that because we fooled them, thousands of soldiers made it home. The legacy of illusion." The Ghost Army's story raises profound questions about the nature of warfare, truth, and heroism. These men didn't fire shots in anger. They didn't storm beaches or capture enemy positions. They didn't fit the traditional image of the warrior. And yet, their contribution to the war effort was immeasurable. They proved that warfare isn't just about physical force. It's about information, about perception, about making your enemy believe something that isn't true, and then exploiting that belief. In many ways, the Ghost Army was ahead of its time. They were practicing information warfare decades before the term existed. Their legacy extends beyond military strategy. Many of the Ghost Army veterans went on to have extraordinary careers in art and design. Bill Blass became one of America's most celebrated fashion designers. Ellsworth Kelly became a giant of abstract art. Art Kane photographed some of the most iconic images in music history. These men took the skills they learned in the Ghost Army, the ability to see the world differently, to create convincing illusions, to think spatially and creatively, and applied them to their peacetime careers. In a way, the Ghost Army was an incubator for American creativity in the second half of the 20th century. But their most important legacy is the lives they saved. Every successful deception meant fewer soldiers in harm's way. Every time they fooled the Germans, they reduced casualties. Estimates vary, but historians believe the Ghost Army's operations saved between 10,000 and 30,000 Allied lives. Think about that. 10,000 to 30,000 soldiers who made it home, because a group of artists inflated rubber tanks and played sound effects. 10,000 to 30,000 families who didn't receive a telegram saying their son or husband or father had been killed in action. That's the real measure of the Ghost Army's success. Not the number of Germans they fooled, but the number of Americans they saved. One Ghost Army veteran, reflecting on his service, said, "We didn't win the war. The soldiers who fought and died, they won the war. But we helped. We did our part. And if our part meant that even one soldier made it home who wouldn't have otherwise, then it was worth it." The Ghost Army also represents something important about American ingenuity. When faced with a problem, how do you deceive an enemy that's watching your every move? The military didn't just rely on traditional solutions. They thought creatively. They recruited artists. They built rubber tanks. They turned warfare into theater. That willingness to think outside the box, to try unconventional solutions, to embrace creativity even in the midst of war, that's a uniquely American trait. And the Ghost Army embodied it perfectly. They were proof that sometimes the best weapon isn't the biggest gun. It's the best idea. Today, the Ghost Army's story serves as a reminder that heroism comes in many forms. It's not just about charging into battle. It's about doing what needs to be done, even if it's unconventional, even if it's strange, even if no one will ever know you did it. The men of the Ghost Army were heroes, not because they killed the enemy, but because they saved their friends. Not because they were the strongest or the bravest, but because they were the smartest and the most creative. They fought a different kind of war, and they won. Their story also reminds us of the power of art. These men were artists first, soldiers second, and they used their art to change the course of history. They painted lies that saved lives. They created illusions that won battles. They proved that creativity isn't just about making beautiful things. It's about solving problems, about seeing possibilities that others miss. In a world that often values force over finesse, the Ghost Army's story is a powerful counterpoint. It shows that sometimes the pen really is mightier than the sword. Or in this case, the paintbrush is mightier than the tank. The final deception. The Ghost Army's last operation came in late March 1945, near the town of Viersen, the same area where they'd staged their greatest deception during the Rhine crossing. By this point, the war in Europe was nearly over. The Allies were pushing deep into Germany. The Nazi regime was collapsing. But there was still fighting, still danger, still a need for deception. The mission was to cover the movement of the Ninth Army as it advanced toward the Ruhr Valley. The Ghost Army would create the illusion that the army was still positioned near the Rhine, while the real units moved east. It was a familiar task by now, but it would be their last. The men of the 23rd set up their equipment one final time. They inflated their rubber tanks. They positioned their dummy artillery. They played their sound recordings. They broadcast their fake radio messages. And for a few days, they maintained the illusion. But this time, something was different. The Germans weren't responding the way they used to. Their reconnaissance flights were less frequent. Their radio chatter was more chaotic. It was clear that the German military was falling apart. The deceptions were still working, but they were almost unnecessary. The war was ending. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The Ghost Army's mission was complete. They packed up their equipment for the last time. The rubber tanks were deflated and stored. The sound trucks were silenced. The radio equipment was shut down. For the men of the 23rd, it was a strange moment. They'd spent nearly a year creating illusions, staging deceptions, living in a world of lies and misdirection. And now, suddenly, it was over. They could stop pretending, stop deceiving, stop being ghosts. But they couldn't talk about it. The mission was still classified. So they went home, back to their lives, carrying the secret of what they'd done. They returned to art schools, to design studios, to ordinary jobs. They became fathers, husbands, teachers, artists, and they never spoke of the Ghost Army. For decades, they lived with the knowledge that they'd been part of something extraordinary, something that had changed the course of the war, something that had saved thousands of lives. But they couldn't share it. They couldn't tell their stories. They were ghosts in more ways than one. Invisible. Forgotten. It wasn't until the 1990s, when the documents were declassified, that they could finally speak. And by then, many of them were old men. Some had already passed away. But those who remained finally had the chance to tell their stories, to explain what they'd done, to share the secret they'd carried for 50 years. And when they did, the world listened. Because the Ghost Army's story is one of the most remarkable in World War II. It's a story of creativity and courage, of art and deception, of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. It's a story that reminds us that war isn't just about violence. It's about intelligence, strategy, and sometimes illusion. The Ghost Army proved that you don't need to be the strongest to win. You just need to be the smartest. You don't need the biggest army. You just need the enemy to think you do. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb. It's an idea. Today, when we think of World War II, we think of D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, the liberation of concentration camps. We think of soldiers storming beaches and pilots flying missions and sailors battling at sea. And all of that is important. All of that is heroic. But we should also think of the Ghost Army, the artists who fought with rubber and paint, the men who created armies out of air, the soldiers who saved lives not by taking them, but by creating illusions so convincing that the enemy never knew what hit them. They were the decoy army that fooled Hitler, the ghost tanks, rubber guns, and sound effects that changed the course of history. And their story, hidden for so long, is finally being told. Because they deserve to be remembered. Not as ghosts, but as heroes. Heroes who proved that sometimes the greatest weapon in war isn't force, it's imagination.